In this video, I'll demonstrate two crystal radios I recently picked up and give some history and technical information on what crystal radios are. The first electronic kit I can remember having was a crystal radio. It must have been a gift from my parents or, as I seem to recall, one of my grandparents. I would have been 5 or 6 years old, and this was the mid-1960s. My dad helped me assemble it. I no longer have it, but I was able to find these pictures of the same model. The only parts inside the futuristic-looking case were a variable tuning coil and a diode. It came with headphones that plugged into the front. We ran a long wire antenna out my second-floor bedroom window to the fence at the end of the backyard. It was grounded to a furnace vent. I could pick up a couple of local AM stations quite well. I remember spending many hours listening to it, sometimes in bed at night. The fact that it needed no batteries made it seem quite magic. I'm certain that this radio helped initiate my lifelong interest in radio and electronics. But what is a crystal radio? A crystal radio receiver, or crystal set, is a simple radio receiver that was popular in the early days of radio. It uses only the energy of the received radio signal to produce sound, needing no external power. The name comes from its use of a detector made from a piece of crystalline material. A crystal detector includes a crystal typically made of galena, a natural mineral form of lead sulfide. A thin wire or metal probe, traditionally called a cat's whisker, contacts the crystal, which is held in place in a cup or other enclosure. Modern crystal sets use semiconductor diodes, usually made from germanium, which operate on the same principle. Crystal radios are the simplest type of receiver and can be made from only a few inexpensive parts: a length of wire for an antenna and a connection to ground, a wire coil, sometimes a variable tuning capacitor, the crystal detector, and earphones. They were commonly built by hobbyists beginning in the 1920s at the dawn of broadcast radio. I recently bought two crystal radios as a lot in an estate auction in Ottawa, Canada for $11 Canadian. The first was this kit from Radio Shack circa 1980s or 90s, although they sold versions with slightly different styling, probably going back to the late 1960s. Labeled with their Science Fair brand and part number 28-219, it came with all parts including the original box and manual. The manual's in English and French, indicating a version made for the Canadian market. The radio was a kit which can be assembled without soldering in half an hour or so. The parts are mounted in a plastic and cardboard frame. Wires are connected using spring terminals, and the circuit diagram is built into the unit. It uses a fixed antenna coil and variable tuning capacitor, as well as a modern germanium diode for the detector. The coil is tapped for either short or long wire antennas. Sound is heard from the included crystal earplug, which is quite sensitive. I recall that my younger brother had this set. His actually looked like the one in this picture. Compared to mine, it looked less like a radio, not having a case, but was easier to tune, and the crystal earphone was more sensitive than the electromagnet headphones that came with my unit. Anyway, this unit came assembled correctly and works about as expected. I hooked it up to my ham radio dipole antenna in the attic of my house, as well as a ground connection. There are only 2 AM radio stations still remaining in my city, and they're not very close to me, but I can pick up both stations clearly enough in the earplug. Obviously you can't hear it, but I can amplify it with these amplified speakers for demo purposes.
$15 billion is a huge amount of money for a very
all season long. The NBA lives on TSN. This Black Friday.
My ham radio antenna is not ideal, as it was designed for some ham radio bands that are higher in frequency than the AM broadcast band. To better match the antenna, I added a 220 picofarad capacitor in series with the antenna. It's always impressive that there's enough energy in the radio waves in the air that they can directly drive an earplug and be audible. The other unit in the auction lot was this old crystal radio, which uses a true cat's whisker and galena detector. It was made on a wooden board, possibly mahogany, with an adjustable coil and binding posts for antenna, ground, and headphones. It also came with this larger piece of galena mineral. By the way, the term breadboarding for a prototype circuit originally came from the construction practice using a wooden board much like this. In some cases, it may have literally been a breadboard. I have it set up and running on the bench. The radio needs an antenna and ground connection. This unit had no headphones, so I used the crystal earplug from the Radio Shack radio. The detector is a galena crystal held in a metal cup. The crystal appears to be embedded in some metal, probably what is known as Wood's metal, an alloy with a low melting point. A piece of stiffed wire, the cat's whisker, is held in place by a lever which can be adjusted in several dimensions. You need to adjust the cat's whisker to contact the galena crystal. By trying various points and adjusting the pressure, you can find a more sensitive area. It's not as critical or hard to adjust as I thought it might be. Tuning uses the slider on the coil and is not that critical, but prone to making a bad connection depending on the point on the coil. I believe the slider and contact are commercial parts, but the wooden coil form and wire were made by hand. When adjusted, I find that it's not quite as sensitive as the Radio Shack unit, likely because the cat's whisker is not as sensitive as the more modern germanium diode. And I suspect that the coil is intended for a long wire antenna and not that well suited to the antenna being used here. Note that the tuning circuit uses the capacitance of the antenna itself as well as that of the coil. I don't know any of the history behind this particular crystal radio, but I would hazard a few guesses about it. It's homemade rather than being a commercially assembled radio. Some of the parts used were commercial components sold to make crystal radios. The workmanship, while not professional, is serviceable, and some effort was put into making it look attractive by beveling the edges, for example. It appears it may have been wired differently or experimented with over time. There's an indication that some wires originally ran under the base, for example. The age is hard to estimate. The wood and components look old. For example, there's no use of modern plastics or wire. The screws are all of the slotted type, which was the norm in the past. Based on this, I would think it couldn't have been built after the 1960s, and potentially it could date back as far as the 1920s when this type of radio was first built, making it potentially 100 years old. The Radio Shack unit brought back memories of the crystal radio I had as a child. The old unit was fascinating. I'd never seen or used a real crystal radio with a cat's whisker and lump of galena mineral. It was fun to actually experience what I'd only read about in books.